Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio, the only show that takes a look at the obstacles and opportunities open to small to mid-sized enterprises that manufacture here in America. Brought to you by All Metals and Forge Group, with your hosts Tim Grady and Lou Wise.
So I'd like to welcome Adriana to the show. How are you today, Adriana?
Fine, thank you.
Great. Glad to have you on the show. And maybe you and Brad can share with our audience what the book is and what it's about. Brad, what was the title of it?
Ethics is the overriding title, and I'm going to let Adriana really talk about the book because she was the inspiration for this and has done, the lion's share of the work in preparing it. I was a contributing author along with a couple. So, Adriana, why don't you pick it up from there?
Sure. The book's title is Business Ethics, Surviving Storms, Challenges, and Ethical Risks. It provides an overview of some of the basic challenges that our multinationals and our executives and our in-house counsel are currently facing with regards to counterfeiting of products, data protection, cybersecurity, and money laundering, all these issues that sometimes our executives may miss or our employees may not be very familiar with.
Now, I noticed in talking with you on this subject and a couple of others, Professor, that there are some liabilities for company executives when they discover issues of this nature. What kind of liabilities are we talking about?
Well, the concern that we have is any decisions that a company takes, any multinational takes, needs to be considered from a global perspective. It needs to be looked at with a global lens because depending on the countries you're working with, some of their legislation has extraterritorial effects. And the approaches may be different, and the new and diverse legislation on how to approach that issue of corruption causes a major ethical dilemma because that executive won't know how to act or that multinational may be caught in the middle.
You gave us an example, which I thought was a great one, which I'd like you to repeat, and you don't have to mention the name of the company, obviously, but a situation where one government, and I think it was the U.S. government, is demanding one thing, but they're involved with another government, and there are a different body of laws that won't allow them to do that thing, and they get caught in a real catch-22. Can you share that?
Sure, that's happening right now, and our multinationals are very concerned because both the U.S. and the region is the EU in that particular case, but it can also happen with Malaysia and the Philippines and the U.S. Or pockets of Latin America. But basically what happens is in some of these countries, there's a duty to report. And there's, just like in the U.S., there's a duty. The U.S. government may be interested in a certain organized, maybe working on an organized criminal investigation, and may immediately want to seize evidence. Well, the EU's laws, they have a basic fundamental right of privacy that they believe in. And there are certain restrictions and there are certain steps you have to take in order to give information to another country. If the company is a U.S. multinational, there are certain requirements and certain things that they must do. U.S. companies and U.S. executives must always comply with U.S. law. You always do, as an American, what you have to do for your country, but then you also must comply with the laws of the other country. So an example is we're seeing it right now with data protection reform, with the EU data protection directive that's in place, where companies are being forced to give information to the U.S. government for investigations, and at the same time they're being told by the EU data protection directive that they cannot, that they must first take certain steps with the EU. There's a predicament. Another one is with the Gatekeepers Initiative. The EU developed the Gatekeepers Initiative in the same way that they had the Know Your Customer for financial institutions. Well, we adopted the Know Your Customer. And when you enter a bank, a teller's going to ask you a whole bunch of questions if you're taking out a lot of money or you're putting in a lot of money. We in the United States have not adopted the Gatekeepers Initiative. This has created a challenge because even though it's not adopted here, it's been adopted, or guidelines or pieces of it have been adopted by the EU and by other regions of the world. And that requires our accountants and our lawyers to disclose money laundering, to disclose anything that they suspect, and especially if they know about corruption, and that puts people in a predicament, because if they disclose it, they may get in trouble, especially if it's a lawyer and they are dealing with a bar. The privacy, attorney-client privilege actually conflicts in some occasions with the laws in the other countries, and it puts these people in a predicament because our governments are not right now collaborating on these issues, and they're not looking at how it affects those executives and those lawyers.
And you don't just have to be a large multinational corporation to have these kind of challenges. Certainly any manufacturer in the U.S. of any size who is purchasing or sourcing product that comes from overseas could have an issue they are not aware of. Is that correct?
That is correct. The requirements are not in line between the countries, and what you're permitted or need to do in some countries can create criminal liability if you don't, especially for executives and for their in-house counsel. And the concern is, how do they react? What should they do? The way I look at this is you need to have moral courage, and you really need to follow your belief system. And if you see that there's terrorist financing, if you see that there's money laundering, we've got our people, we've got our law enforcement and our military out there risking their lives. And in my opinion, our war on terrorism is only as strong as our weakest link, and we can't let that weak link be our business link. So we have to stand up if we see this. And our countries need to work together so that we can have a global security front.
Lou, before we sign off with Professor Sanford, is there anything else that you would like to explore with her on this topic?
Well, I think that her last comments, Professor, are quite powerful. And, we are talking about global issues. It's no longer our country, our little country that is running the roost. We're all involved together, and I think it was a very good point that you were bringing out, that this is global, and that perhaps what needs to be done is that these laws and regulations from one country to another have to be universalized, if there's such a word, and working together to end this plague of bad parts, risking of life, and supporting terrorism. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for being on our show, and we're going to see you on a regular basis. I do want to mention to our listeners that 2 points. One is that you can listen to this entire show if you missed the beginning of it at mfgtalkradio.com. And also, you will see when you go to this particular show that we do have a listener survey that we'd really like you to participate in. And we're giving you one of our fancy Manufacturing Talk Radio mugs for filling out the survey. So we would like you to take advantage of that. And thirdly, I would like to point out that if any of our listeners have comments, we welcome your comments and we'll respond to all of them. Send your comments to comments@mfgtalkradio.com. And I guess while I'm on a roll, I may as well speak about next week's show. We're going to have our 5th in a series, 5 of 5, Aerospace on the West Coast. So surely tune in to that. And, Tim, I think you got more than you bargained for here, so I'm going to flip it back to you.
That's okay. I want to thank Brad Holcomb for being on the show. Brad is always a terrific contributor to give in-depth information on this report on business for manufacturing. There's so much more behind the number when you hear 52.8 for May, which is usually the sound bite on the nightly news. There's so much more information there in the report. We encourage you to go to the instituteforsupplymanagement.org and drill down in their section for the ISM report on business. Take a look at that. I want to thank Dr. Sanford for joining us again on the show. She is our kind of another recurring guest, our special ethics correspondent. Dr. Sanford, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we look forward to hearing from both of those guests in future shows, and that wraps us up today for Manufacturing Talk Radio. If you would like to follow us on something like Twitter, it's at MFG Talk Radio. Go to our website, mfgtalkradio.com, to listen to any of our previous shows. Also, this show will be posted there very shortly. And we thank you for listening to the Manufacturing Talk Radio today, the voice of manufacturing globally.
Thanks for joining us on Manufacturing Talk Radio. You can hear our next broadcast each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at mfgtalkradio.com.